According to ethnomusicologist Bonnie Wade, show player Miyata Mayumi is recognized by, quote, everyone as the performer who is at the center of the show being used everywhere, end quote. This is hardly an exaggeration. Throughout her career, Miyata has performed both classical Gagaku and contemporary repertoire within and outside of Japan. Despite her well-established reputation, Miyata is nevertheless considered an outsider to Gagaku. First, Miyata does not perform with the music department of the Imperial Household Agency, nor does she come from a family of hereditary Gagaku musicians. Second, Miyata began learning the show as an adult after receiving a degree in piano performance at the Kunitachi College of Music. Miyata's relatively late arrival to the instrument contrasts with the backgrounds of professional musicians in the Imperial Household Agency, who have studied Gagaku and Western art music concurrently since their childhood. When Miyata began her career in the 1970s, it was still rare for someone trained outside the Imperial Household Agency to establish themselves as a professional Gagaku musician. In this paper, I argue that Miyata's unconventional musical background enabled her to expand the boundaries of Gagaku beyond its Japanese and traditional cultural framings, which have continued to permeate discourses on Japanese music since the Meiji period. Leron James Harrison notes that scholars and the Agency for Cultural Affairs in Japan have put forth a restricting narrative of Gagaku, quote, confining it temporally to the Heian period and spatially to select places such as the Imperial Palace, end quote. In Harrison's view, such discourses have, quote, alienated Gagaku from the cultural landscape of post-war Japan, end quote, in effect limiting the different ways in which Gagaku can be imagined and understood today. By designating musicians of the Imperial Household Agency as the gatekeepers of tradition, current narratives of Gagaku exclude musicians such as Miyata, who has substantially expanded the repertoire for solo show through commissions, while continuing to perform classical and reconstructed Gagaku repertoire with the renowned ensemble Reigakusha, with whom she has been performing since its founding in 1985. Through an analysis of Miyata's performances of traditional and contemporary repertoire for solo show, this paper situates Miyata as an indispensable figure for the development of classical Gagaku and contemporary concert music, despite being strikingly absent from the historiographical narratives of both genres. Following the work of Andrea Joly, I focus exclusively on Miyata to draw attention to the ways in which her performances, quote, destabilize the naturalized association of Gagaku with Japaneseness, end quote. Through an analysis of Miyata's recordings, I demonstrate how her performances invite intercultural modes of listening to and understanding Gagaku in the 21st century. While Miyata's performance of Oshikichou no Choshi highlights affinities between the Gagaku tonal system and Western tonality, her performance of 1-9, a collaborative piece between Miyata and John Cage, is heavily informed by performance techniques from classical Gagaku. Miyata's performances of these two works reveal the rich possibilities of analyzing Gagaku beyond the confines of traditional Japanese music. By drawing upon a mixture of Japanese and Western theories of music, I demonstrate how Miyata's performance of the show is shaped by her involvement with classical Gagaku and contemporary music written in Western notation. In order to examine how Miyata's performances challenged the framing of Gagaku as a traditional Japanese musical genre, I call into question previous analyses of contemporary Japanese music that have relied heavily on Edward Said's framework of Orientalism. First, I suggest that neither classical nor contemporary repertoire fit neatly into the categories of Japan and the West. This dichotomy is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, the binary assumes that the categories of Japan West and traditional contemporary remain static and do not interact. Secondly, Orientalist critiques by John Corbett and others have focused predominantly on the role of composers. This perspective minimizes the agency of performers such as Miyata, whose collaborative work with composers and knowledge of Western music and Gagaku have been indispensable to the emergence of the show in Western contemporary music. In Miyata's case, challenging the self-other divide elevates the performer from a passive mediator between the score-based work and listeners into an active collaborator. Second, given that the understanding of music as an object of aesthetic contemplation was imported into Japan from the West, I argue that performances of Gagaku in the 21st century are inherently intercultural. Terauchi Naoko has shown that the conceptualization of Gagaku as music to be heard is fairly recent, shaped by the founding of the National Theatre of Japan in the 1960s. Prior to the Meiji era, Gagaku was often performed outdoors in palace courtyards, shrines, and temples to accompany rituals and ceremonies. Consequently, the murmur of voices, rustling of trees, ringing bells, and other quote-unquote non-musical sounds in the Western sense were as much a part of the acoustic environment as the sounds of instruments. Modern concert halls, which are designed to shut out external noise and separate the stage from the audience, introduce new ways of listening to Gagaku. I will now demonstrate through analysis the various ways in which Miyata's performance invite us to reconsider the boundary between traditional Japanese and modern Western. First, I suggest that Miyata's performance of Oshikicho no Choshi produces a renewed formal and tonal identity for the work. Second, I argue that 1-9, while being a contemporary work, actively incorporates aspects of traditional performance practice. Shifting my discussion to Oshikicho no Choshi, I will now demonstrate how Miyata's performance establishes a new formal identity for the work. Although Miyata's performances of Choshi preludes can vary significantly from one another according to the needs of each performance, Miyata's recording of Oshikicho no Choshi in the 2004 album Deep Silence alters the formal structure in a peculiar way. The chart on the slide compares the formal organization of Oshikicho no Choshi as notated today and as recorded in Deep Silence. While the notated version of Oshikicho no Choshi, shown on the left, is comprised of 16 sections, Miyata's recording, shown on the right, features only 8 sections. Her version omits sections 4 and 5 and concludes after section 10. According to Miyata, the omissions of sections 4, 5, and 11 through 16 was a one-off decision to accommodate the time constraints of the CD and does not reflect conventional performance practice. Given that a performance of Oshikicho no Choshi can amount to 20 minutes or more when performed in its entirety, Miyata's decision to perform an abbreviated version represents a flexible and pragmatic solution to performing classical repertoire in the early 21st century. Miyata's abridged version of Oshikicho no Choshi also reflects careful consideration of formal and tonal consequences. Each section of a choshi ends with a cadential drone outlining an interval of a Pythagorean fifth. The cadential drone usually involves either the first and fifth degrees of the mode, A and E in the case of Oshikicho, or the fifth and second degrees of the mode, E and B. I will refer to the AE drone as 1 and the EB drone as 5. As I've shown on the slide, section 1 ends with a 5 cadential drone. The E5, E6 drone in event 1.2 is filled in by B5 in event 1.3 to complete the E5, B5, E6 fifth. The so-called 5 drone is then held for 3 long breaths and 2 short breaths to signify the end of the section. I will now play this excerpt. As shown on the slide, 14 out of the 16 notated sections ends with a cadential drone on A4, E5, A5, and on E5, B5, E6. Regardless of mode, each choshi always concludes with a 1 drone, comprised of the first and fifth modal degrees. I suggest that the 1 cadential drone is analogous to a cadence on the tonic harmony in Western tonal music. My claim here mirrors music theorist Daniel Harrison's concept of dronality, which suggests that a perfect fifth drone can theoretically and cognitively signify a tonal center. In Oshikicho no Choshi, every section that ends with a 1 drone is preceded by a section ending with a 5 drone. In Miyata's abridged performance, she eliminates sections that end on a 2 drone, that's B4, F sharp 5, B5. As a result, the cadential pattern in Miyata's performance establishes a symmetrical formal structure that alternates between the 5 drone and 1 drone. Miyata's alteration of form can also be explained by tonal considerations. Since every performance of Choshi must conclude with a 1 drone, there are 6 candidates for the final section of Oshikicho no Choshi. Section 2, 6, 8, 10, 14, or 16. Why did it make the most sense for her to choose section 10? Section 2 is unlikely to be the final section since sections 1 and 2 constitute the 2 shortest sections in the entire piece. Sections 14 and 16 must similarly be ruled out since Miyata was required to shorten her performance of the piece for recording purposes. Sections 6 and 8 are also improbable options, since sections 1 to 6 frequently feature tones that are not part of the Oshikicho mode. To give an example, section 6, shown on the slide, features 2 pitch classes that are not included in the mode, C sharp and G sharp. In contrast to sections 1 through 6, which use an abundance of tones outside the mode, the majority of pitch classes in sections 7 to 10 belong to the mode. For instance, section 10, which I've shown on the slide, features pitches G5 and C6. Since the modal quality of Oshikicho becomes more salient beginning in section 7, concluding the Choshi after section 6 or 8 leaves little room for listeners to experience the melodic, modal, and affective qualities of the mode. Miyata has echoed my observation, recommending that performances of Oshikicho no Choshi should play beyond section 7 to highlight the unique modal characteristics of Oshikicho. Navigating the modal, formal, and temporal considerations leaves us with section 10 as the most ideal section with which to conclude Miyata's performance. Section 10 ends with a 1 cadential drone, shortens Miyata's performance of the piece into an appropriate length for recording, and presents 4 full sections where the pitch content is based solidly in Oshikicho. As a consequence of ending her performance of Oshikicho no Choshi after section 10, Miyata divides the piece into 2 contrasting formal sections. Part 1, which is comprised of sections 1, 2, 3, and 6, and Part 2, which is composed of sections 7 to 10. While the pitch content of Part 2 adheres closely to that of the Oshikicho mode, Part 1 frequently includes pitches, C sharp and G sharp, that do not belong to the mode. I will now play excerpts from Part 1 and Part 2. That was Part 1, and now here's Part 2. In my brief analytical case study, I've examined how Miyata's alteration of form for Oshikicho no Choshi produces a renewed identity for a traditional prelude. Analyzing Miyata's performances also highlights her creative agency over the performance of classical repertoire. 1-9 was born out of a collaboration between Miyata and John Cage after he met Miyata at the Darmstadt summer course in 1990. When composing 1-9, Cage consulted Miyata on the mechanics of show performance. As part of their compositional process, Miyata provided Cage with a set of detailed notes on the topography of the instrument, list of overtones, possible fingerings, and traditional clusters. Ueno Masaaki described the collaboration process between Cage and Miyata as follows. Cage would first generate the notes using I Ching, after which Miyata would play back the selected notes. The two would then discuss the results together, though Cage would ultimately decide which pitches will be included in the piece. Given her active role in the creative process, the completion of 1/9 would have been unthinkable without Miyata's active participation and enthusiasm towards contemporary music. The nature of their close collaboration is reflected in an undated facsimile sent by Cage to Miyata sometime in 1991, which is archived at the Northwestern University Library's John Cage collection. The facsimile reads, 1/9 and 2/3 were written for Mayumi Miyata and with her help. For this reason, the history of collaboration between Miyata and Cage problematizes Courbet's depiction of Cage as an Orientalist, since such a framework minimizes key figures like Miyata. As Miki Kaneda suggests, Cage was, quote, not simply influenced by Zen or Japan in the abstract sense, but by real living individual Japanese composers and thinkers, end quote. Viewing Miyata as a collaborator acknowledges her key role in bringing Cage to the intercultural musical space in which she worked. 1/9 belongs to a larger collection of works called the number pieces. The number pieces are structured according to a compositional system called the time brackets. The slide shows the time brackets for the 8th section of 1/9. The performer must begin playing each system during the time interval given on the left, and must complete all sounding events in the system within the time interval given on the right. The performer has a large degree of autonomy over the execution of each of the time brackets. As long as the performer adheres to the time intervals indicated, the duration, placement, dynamics, and articulation of pitches can vary widely from performance to performance. I will now play events 1 to 2, which are shown on the slide. By examining the 8th section of 1/9, I will provide a snapshot of how aspects of performance practice for traditional music inform Miyata's performance. Similarly to Oshikicho no Choshi, 1/9 isolates the show from the context of traditional ensemble performance. 1/9 also requires an altered version of the instrument that adopts an A440 tuning. The two muted pipes in the traditional show are given reeds for B-flat 5 and F5. In this light, it may seem as if 1/9 has successfully detached itself from the realm of classical Gagaku. But examining Miyata's performance reveals that they have much in common with the traditional clusters of Gagaku. Miyata's notes on the mechanics of show performance, which are currently archived in the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, suggest that fingering conventions from traditional Gagaku practice form the basis of a performance. The slide compares Miyata's notes on contemporary show fingerings, prepared for Cage prior to their collaboration, with fingerings used in classical repertoire. All of Cage's pitch clusters can be played using the default fingerings provided by Miyata, which are identical to those of traditional practice. The correspondence between the two is best illustrated by events 41 and 49, the only clusters requiring the use of all 7 fingers. As I've shown on the slide, each note maps onto a discrete finger based on traditional practice. Similarly, events 51 and 52 together constitute a 7-note cluster in which each note can be played exactly according to traditional fingerings. I will now play events 41, 49, and 51 to 52 in succession. I encourage you to follow along. As I've shown on the slide, many of Cage's clusters are also remarkably similar to traditional clusters. Out of the 27 3-pitch clusters, 11 of them, that's 40.7%, include A5 and B5, a combination of tones which is present in every traditional cluster. Because the A5-B5 dyad is sounding throughout the performance of a Gagaku piece, it is the most ubiquitous sound made by the sho in the genre. In any given performance, the left index and left middle fingers are always covering the pipes for A5 and B5, and the two pitches act as a drone, sounding from the moment the sho enters until the end of the piece. In fact, beginning sho players are often taught early on that the left index and left middle fingers always remain fixed on these two pipes. The frequency at which A5 and B5 appear together in a cluster suggests that the pitch material of Cage's clusters is in dialogue with that of traditional Aitake clusters. In addition, while each of the clusters in the 8th section of 1-9 differs from those that are heard in classical repertoire, they can be played using fingering conventions from classical Gagaku. The A5-B5 dyad not only evokes a sound that is strongly associated with the traditional pitch clusters played by the sho and Gagaku, but also invites a gestural experience similar to that of performing classical repertoire. Miyata's performance therefore features an interconnected web of cultural meanings. A Japanese performer trained in Western art music, playing a work co-written with an American composer in Western notation, drawing upon classical Japanese performance practice on an instrument imported from China. In sum, while 1-9 has sought to isolate the sho from the context of Gagaku performance, an examination of the clusters reveals that their sonic tapestry is not completely detached from that of the traditional clusters. These findings offer an alternative reading of intercultural synthesis in 1-9, which not only avoids oversimplistic East-West dichotomies when discussing the relationship between avant-garde and traditional Japanese music, but also gives Miyata due credit for her collaborative work in creating this piece. In my paper, I've explored the ways in which Miyata Mayumi's solo sho performances contest the boundaries between traditional Japanese and modern Western. While at first glance, Miyata's performing repertoire implicitly relies on a dichotomous division between the two, my analysis has shown that this is not the case. Miyata's performance of Oshikicho no Choshi recontextualizes a classical ensemble prelude into a standalone work for solo sho, producing a renewed formal identity for the work. Her performance of 1-9 incorporates elements of traditional performance practice. Taking Oshikicho no Choshi and 1-9 as case studies, I've demonstrated how Miyata's performances break down the fraught categories of traditional Japanese and contemporary Western music. By highlighting Miyata's role as a creative collaborator, this study offers a new approach to analyzing the contribution of performers in the creation of intercultural musical meaning. Thank you.